The following speaker is Frank Wilderson, and it's really very exciting for me to introduce Frank. We're all excited for Frank being here. Frank is a professor in the United States in the University of California. Irene, I've never been able to pronounce it properly. I know I might be wrong there. But he has a long history here in this country and in this university. So in many ways, Frank is coming back to something that I think, based on his book, Incognito, was his political home, or a place in which, in many ways he became politicized or acted some of his very early politics. I suppose in this instance, welcome South Africa as well. I mean, he's been in the country already for a very long time. So over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Am I speaking loud enough now? Oh, a little higher. Okay. I'm getting hoarse. Okay. But I'll try to project. I thank so much to Prashani and Ahmed for doing whatever needed to be done to get me here. And it's been really wonderful and kind of strange in a good way coming back. I mean, I look out in the audience, I see all these faces that were really influential to me and changed my life in so many ways. In the preface of my second book, which is called Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, I say, which I'll just say very briefly here, how my time in South Africa really helped me look back at politics in the United States in a way that I don't think I would have been able to have done had I not lived here for 5.5 years. And when I came here, I used to say that, whenever anyone would hear your accent, you go into a restaurant, they go, "Oh, we're not multiracial, I'm sorry," Then they'd hear your accent, they go, "Oh, my American friend, I'm so sorry, come in, please, eat, And they'd ask me, how do you like it here? And I would say, every day is worse than the day before. Because I'd intended to stay for 1 year while my ex-wife finished law school here at Wits. And I was working as a waiter, and I just want to say, since I see her in the audience, thank you to Ulrika Kistner, who actually gave me my first teaching job ever. And I had no papers or documents with which to work. No, I had a tourist visa, and I was a waiter at Luigi's restaurant somewhere here in Braamfontein. And I actually parlayed that job into an actual career everywhere I went. So it was really a wonderful thing that you did for me, and all the political engagements that I had with people like Andile and Prashani in the streets here, and Stephen Greenberg and Dale McKinley. It's your genuine hatred for the United States of America, which helped me to solidify my hatred when I went back. Okay, so I'm gonna cut out a lot of what I want to say, but this is I sent Prashani an article, part of a chapter from Red, White, and Black, which was a critique of Hart and Negre's conception of the commons through what we're beginning to call in the United States Afro-pessimism. And I was going to try and present that, but it's so convoluted and long that it would take too long. And the other thing about it is, since this is a book in which the cultural object is cinema, everyone would have had to have some kind of familiarity with the film for me to do that. So what instead I'm going to do is take a slice of another article I wrote for a journal in Canada, and it's called It's called The Vengeance of Vertigo, Aphasia and Abjection in the Political Trials of Black Insurgents. And I hope that what we can see, that there's going to be some kind of synergy between the interventions that Peter raised here and what I'm saying. I'm working, if we think of, just as a term of crude shorthand, 3 registers of subjectivity, preconscious interests, what is available to speech and what I can say about myself, and then unconscious identification, where Peter has brought us so wonderfully. I'm actually working in a 3rd register. I'm trying to make an intervention in and against and through the assumptive logic of structural positionality, which is how and where people are placed in paradigm. So those are the possibilities of my research, but they're also, to let you know firsthand, there's some of the limitations in that I leave the other two registers of subjectivity touched upon but not fully interrogated in order to deal with this kind of paradigmatic analysis. And we can debate that or talk about that as I go on. So in this particular piece, what I'm trying to do is take this particular moment in history, which was the second most, or perhaps this is the first most, I don't know, one of the most important moments in history that were influential to me as a young man, which is this kind of transitional moment from civil rights to black power, when so many of the student movements were picking up the gun, as we used to say, and becoming insurgents. And I'm thinking here in this particular piece about the kind of the denouement of this, where the Weather Underground, which is the armed offshoot of SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, form a kind of armed struggle coalition with the Black Liberation Army, which is the underground component of the Black Panthers. Once the Panthers are decimated, what we have is the 1970s action from the Black Liberation Army working in conjunction with the Weather Underground. And they both think of themselves politically as having the same agenda and as being positioned paradigmatically in the same way. And what I want to do here is take a moment, the moment of the trial, and kind of problematize that what I would call ruse of analogy. Okay, David Gilbert and Judy Clark, two former members of the Weather Underground, stood trial with Kwazi Balagoon, the only openly bisexual member of the Black Liberation Army, in what is commonly referred to as the Brinks trial. This was a bank expropriation that took place in upstate New York by the Black Liberation Army with a task force of white revolutionaries alongside them. And it's an expropriation that went afoul. They were captured, and they're now on trial. They went on trial in 1981. So they sat out, these revolutionaries sat out much of the trial arguing, and I just want to ask the back row, am I projecting well enough now? Okay, great. They sat out much of the trial arguing that to participate would be to recognize the legitimacy of the court to criminalize political acts.
Frank?
Yes?
What? There's a request that you kind of slow down.
Oh, okay. I'm trying to get into my time here and get my thing.
We have one speaker that withdrew, so we've got a little bit more time.
Okay.
And
no, I do
suspected
understand
that we might have to distribute this time here. So
I was told, when I taught at Wits and Vista, I was informed that the language that I thought was English all my life was actually not English. It was a rude awakening. But so I do understand, you know. You'll have to. I'm a bastard from a bastard country speaking a bastard language, so I will try very hard to. All right. Okay. So basically, what I said is that there are two white Americans, Judy Clark and David Gilbert, who have been involved with Kwazi Balagoon and the Black Liberation Army in an expropriation. They get caught, they're busted, and now there's a trial happening. What happened is that, what I said is that they refused to participate in their trial because they're informing the court that they're not criminals, they're political subjects. Okay. All right. When they did appear in court, it was to make statements condemning white supremacy and U.S. imperialism. They argued that the United States government lacked the legal basis to try them, both because of the political character of their actions and because of the government's own illegitimacy. They rejected the terms of jurisprudential engagement by refusing the hermeneutics of individual guilt or innocence. They believed the power to pose the question is the greatest power of all. In short, they sought to short-circuit the court's disciplinary logic by exploiting their trial, a window of time between arraignment and incarceration, as an opportunity to shift the terms of adjudication from moral questions of guilt and innocence to ethical questions of state power and political legitimacy. If acquittal came with the counter-hegemonic gains of this Gramscian war of position, so be it. If not, well, those were always the risks. Am I slow enough? Am I slow enough? Okay. They weren't alone in their analysis. The verdict of an article called "The Verdict of International Tribunal on Political Prisoners and Prisoners of War in the United States," published by the Yale Journal of Law and Liberation, declared that the U.S. should follow the same international protocol with political prisoners in the U.S. as it does with prisoners on the battlefields abroad. The tribunal used the Geneva Convention to frame the defendants as anti-colonial combatants. There were examples of the effects of pedagogy and praxis, less ludic than, I'm sorry, I cut out a big piece here, which I'm referring to here, in which Assata Shakur, who was a Black Liberation Army soldier who escaped from prison and is now living in Cuba, said that when her trial began, another trial for killing a police officer on the New Jersey Turnpike, there were a courtroom full of black and white radicals, and some had their children with them. And when the judge walked in, a little child turned to her mother and said, "Mommy, is that the fascist pig?" So there were examples of the effects of pedagogy and praxis, less ludic than small children who inquired as to which species of pig a federal judge belongs to. The trials occurred within a context wherein there was a tacit consensus on the left which espoused non-cooperation with law enforcement officials. David Gilbert from the Weather Underground explains how his underground cell's ability to elude a police dragnet in San Francisco and flee to Oregon and establish new identities was less a result of their clandestine skills than of the anti-state political consciousness that prevailed in youth culture in the 60s and 70s, which meant that information did not flow to the state, but flowed to the Weather Underground. The fruits of this counter-hegemonic context, the transformation, I would say, of Gramscian common sense, apprehensive or inscrutable cooperation with the cops, to good sense, which is non-cooperation with the cops, can also be glimpsed by taking stock of the plethora of progressives, not radical, but progressives, who, when they were called before grand juries, began their testimony by announcing that they would not answer any of the questions put to them. By refusing to answer the questions of the grand jury, the witness was all but guaranteeing an 18-month prison sentence. But by refusing to answer all questions prior to their being asked, the witness performed a rejection of the grand jury's right to convene, an ethical refusal of the legal system itself, as opposed to a moral objection of legal excesses. And that's an important distinction I want to make, a refusal of the court as opposed to a refusal of excesses of the court. Ironically, this ethical refusal actually shaved years off their prison sentences. If the witness had engaged the court in conversation, that is, listened to the questions and then either answered or rejected the questions, he or she would have served 18 months for each unanswered question for contempt of court. But by announcing his or her refusal to participate in the process, he or she could only be convicted on one count of contempt. This is not to say, however, that political awareness and the politics of refusal that resisted state violence in the 60s and 70s developed along an increasingly enlightened point-for-point pilgrim's progress. As we ascend from the commonplace to the rare, that is, from grand jury refusals of everyday progressives who risk serving 18 months for contempt, to the trials of the Black Liberation Army soldiers who refused the decorum and the discourse of the court, though they faced life imprisonment for paramilitary activity. In other words, even for the ideologically unified segment of the movement committed to armed struggle, we find that the black paramilitaries' orientation to the court resists singular and unified interpretation. Some scholars interpret their jurisprudential engagements as the sine qua non of a politics of refusal. Others see them as being underwritten by rank reformism. And I'm going to skip over that part, but what I mean by that is that one legal scholar writes about the ways in which Huey P. Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, and Bobby Seale were so deeply invested in the law and the courts, and how they read law books, and how they, and how even though they were fighting in an armed struggle, their points of attention and their fixations were on questions of constitutional legality. And so what he argues is that they were actually more cathected to the American state and the judicial system than your average right-wing National Rifle Association right to bear arms person. Another legal scholar argues that the performance of BLA, Black Liberation Army political prisoners in the court says something different, that their refusal to participate actually draws a line, makes it difficult for lawyers to argue their case, because the lawyer is trying to do a legal thing, as we say, and the revolutionary is trying to do the necessary thing in court. So there's this division as to what did these black revolutionaries were they caught in a static positivism and an oversimplified, reductive, ahistorical jurisprudence, or were they truly mobilizing an absolute refusal of the court's right to exist? And what I'm going to be saying is that could be an open question, but that's not my issue here. I'm after some other game. The necessary thing, which is the absolute refusal, ran the gamut from taking judges and officers of the court hostage, as Jonathan Jackson did in Marin, to refusing to stand when the court, when the judge came in, to turning the court into liberation school, and that kind of thing. One example of this this performative politics of refusal comes in the poem that Kwasi Balagoon read he read as part of his sentencing statement when he was being sentenced. And the poem goes like this, after he's being sentenced for killing 2 police officers in the Brinks armored car appropriation. It's called Your Honor. Your Honor, since I've been convicted of murder and have taken time to digest just what that means, after noting what it means to my family and how it affects people who read the newspapers and all, I see now that I've made a terrible mistake and didn't approach this trial in a respectful, deliberate, or thoughtful manner, didn't take advantage of the best legal advice, and based my actions on irrelevant matters, which I can see now in a much more sober mind had nothing to do with this case. I must have been legally insane thinking about the 25 murders of black children in Atlanta since the so-called murderer, Wayne Williams, was captured, the recent murder of a black man in Boston by the police, the recent murders of 2 in Chicago by the police, the shooting of a 5-year-old little boy in suburban California, the lynching in Alabama, the mob murder of transit workers in Brooklyn, the murders of 14 women in Boston. Feeling that this is evidence of something, and that there must be a lesson in all this, I thought murder was legal. Balagoon's poem is an example of the necessary thing that the scholar Evelyn Williams noted, the kind of performative gestures the BLA political prisoners were famous for. It demonstrates how the court is systemically linked in the ongoing Black Holocaust. But as a testimony, it is incomplete, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. Its deepest insight is the conclusion that it reaches that the law is white, coupled with the inference that Balagoon was guilty prior to the Brinks expropriation, prior to his trial. His innocence cannot be vouchsafed until all semblance of the law has been eradicated. The poem's closing line, I thought murder was legal, locates the court at the end of a metonymic chain of hate crimes, and thus politicizes the presumed impartiality of the pending violence. the life sentence about to be handed down to him. Such counter-hegemonic gestures are part of a process that Gramsci describes as a war of positions, isolation, and emasculation of the ruling class. But the Gramscian model breaks down because the subject of the poem, black people, are not Gramscian subjects. From the poem, we get a sense that black people are being killed because they are black people. This is different from the Gramscian subject who is killed because she or he goes on strike or lays siege to a factory. Another spanner in the Gramscian works is evident in the way the deaths are narrated. The body count Balagoon offers reads like a report on Holocaust atrocities, through which we get no sense of the people who existed before the Holocaust or the impacts of this Holocaust on their polity, their cosmology, their structures of feeling, or the capacity of their offspring to go on living. Kawazi Balagoon's testimony is incomplete because taxonomy can itemize atrocities but cannot bear witness to suffering, and a conceptual framework of redress is contingent upon a subject's capacity to bear witness. The structural violence that positions Balagoon paradigmatically makes the degree of psychic integration required in order to bear witness all but impossible, thereby undermining the status of his claims at the level of identity and, by extension, undermining his capacity to offer a testimony on trauma or a narrative of redress, be it juridical or political. I am humbled by the courage and tenacity it must have taken to use the space and time allotted to the BLA, for reading atrocities into the public record, often at the expense of adjudicating the charges levied against them. But the reportage of atrocities is just that, reportage, laden with spectacle and light on sustained meditations on trauma. How can a sense of redress, juridical or political, emerge from a context where sustained meditations on trauma have no purchase? The synchronic homologies between the status of the slave and the status of black subjectivity are manifested diachronically as historical continuity. In other words, there are important continuities between the ethical dilemmas raised when a slave stood before the bar in the 19th century and when black insurgents in the Black Liberation Army stood before the bar in the 1970s and early 1980s. The Dred Scott trials of 1847, 1850, and 1852 and 1857 in the Supreme Court are exemplary of this. So Dred Scott was a slave. His master brought him to the Northern Territories, I think to Minnesota, and he said because he went to a territory that did not have slavery, he was no longer a slave and deserved manumission. And so he argued this through various lower courts, appellate courts, and then all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I'm going to tell you the end of where I'm going in case I don't get enough time to go all the way to the end. But several courts, I can't remember. Anyway, some courts said, yes, you ended up in Minnesota, and therefore you're not a slave anymore because you're in a free state. Others said the master didn't release you because so you have to go back to slavery. The Supreme Court sent him back to slavery, but the 255-page decision is actually not in line with the courts that sent him back to slavery. What it says is that, and this comes to one of our titles here, the word common, is that the lower courts both made jurisprudential errors, not in the content of the decision, but in adjudicating the case to begin with. That they should have understood that as an African, Scott actually has no political standing, and therefore he can have no jurisprudential standing. He has no standing as a subject. So he should have been sent back to slavery on the basis of he had no right to appear to adjudicate his his case. And so this is where I'm trying to get to basically show, if we don't get to all of it, how the desire to be a juridical subject on the part of Dred Scott is as problematic as the desire to be a political subject on the part of the BLA. That we're back at a kind of generic problem that recognition and incorporation are generically anti-black. Okay, how am I doing? No more. Okay. All right. Try to go fast without slurring. So, one could argue that Dred Scott was pushing in the opposite direction of the Black Liberation Army, that he wanted to depoliticize the court so that it would focus on the narrow and just interpretation of existing law. But I am not asserting historical continuity of courtroom strategies. The historical continuity of the Dred Scott case and the BLA trials isn't a continuity of performance, but a continuity of position. Chief Justice Taney's 1957 majority decision was an early rejoinder to the Black Liberation Army's demand 124 years later that their standing before the court be recognized as political rather than juridical. Taney returned Dred Scott to slavery by arguing in the opposite direction of the BLA, from the juridical to the political. Taney argues that Dred Scott has no standing as a juridical subject because he has no standing as a political subject. Justice Taney implies that there is a structural injunction precluding the court from hearing Scott's case because blacks come from Africa, a place void of political community, and only members of political community can stand before the bar. He writes, "The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported and sold as slaves become a member of political community?" Taney is compelled to compare the black to the American Indian as a necessary prerequisite to legitimate the court's decision to re-enslave Dred Scott. In doing so, he triangulates the dyad between the human and the black with the Indian. He writes, "The situation of the black population was altogether unlike the Indian race. The blacks, the Indians, it is true, formed no part of the colonial communities and never amalgamated with them in social connections or in government. But although they were uncivilized, they were yet free and independent people, associated together in nations or tribes and governed by their own laws. Many of the political communities were situated in territories to which the white race claimed the ultimate right of dominion," end quote. Now, from the opening of Taney's tangential pursuit of Native Americans, it would seem that they constitute a defeated and denigrated identity within the human race, devalued humanity as opposed to the embodiment of social death, black people. Taney's writing speaks of a being with subjective presence and of a community with the capacity for what Lewis Gordon calls the perspective of consciousness. They were uncivilized, yet free and independent, associated together in nations or tribes and governed by their own laws. Furthermore, Indians are not natally alienated because their claim to their offspring are recognized by and incorporated into the world, genocide notwithstanding. By extension, their right to govern is acknowledged beyond their circle, which is to say their claims to temporal presence are recognized, just as their spatial presence is recognized and incorporated, which is to say their place names have resistance in the eyes of the other, that famous Fanon quote. Many of the political communities were Taney writes, many of the political communities were situated in territories to which the white race claimed the ultimate right of dominion. Taney goes on to impose imaginary and fantastic formulations on what heretofore in the ruling has been sober and realist prose buttressed by relational, albeit racist logic. So now he moves from a kind of logical thing to a kind of fantasy, and he writes, Indian governments were regarded and treated as foreign governments. Now, can you imagine? he came there. All right. As foreign governments. As much so as if an ocean had separated the red man for the white. I mean, the narrative of immigration is so nauseating in America. It just permeates everything, right? So Indians were regarded as and treated as foreign governments as much so as if an ocean had separated the red man from the white. And their freedom has constantly been acknowledged from the time of the first immigration to the English colonies to the present day by the different governments which succeeded each other, rather. End quote. Now, through a process of condensation and displacement, or perhaps jurisprudential dream work, Taney maps the imaginary of settlerism onto the body of indigenism. Like the dreamer who brings his own water to the beach, Justice Taney has to manufacture an ocean out of dry land, lest the analogy between whites and Indians crumbles. And this analogy is absolutely necessary to maintaining Dred Scott in his paradigmatic location of social death. Justice Taney's phantasmagorical and labyrinthine dream work labors to substantiate Native American humanity, genocide notwithstanding, in order to reinvigorate black social isolation, the practice of chattel slavery, and black ontological isolation, the paradigm of social death, and thereby stave off a crisis of coherence amongst humans. A crisis of coherence which all three lower court decisions threaten despite their opposing verdicts. The lower courts, one finding for Dred Scott, two finding against Dred Scott, made the same mistake as Roman jurisprudence, which declared the essence of slavery to be the ownership of one human being by another. This is not, I argue in other places that Orlando Patterson has tried to show us how this notion of property ownership as a definitional lens for slavery is actually something that reports on the experience of slavery and does little to help us with the paradigm of slavery. This fictive discourse gave Dred Scott the opening he needed to bring his case to court. Taney's ruling, however, was predicated on the understanding that any person can be an object of a property relation because all people have proprietary claims and powers sunk into them like talents, whether they are husbands, wives, or in modern times, professional athletes. But not all people are slaves. To say I own my slave, but I don't own my wife is spurious, merely a form of convention. But the subjective meaning of the convention is an essential aspect of the slave's lack of honor. To try Dred Scott's case by addressing the question of whether or not he was owned, would be to recognize and incorporate him into political ontology and the legal framework of human beings. And that, in effect, would rob political ontology and, by extension, rob the law itself of meaning and coherence. The declaration that Africa is void of political community, linked together with the fantasy of immigration mobilized to situate, by contrast, the Indian, the Native American, within political community, was a vital intervention which reminded the lower courts that general dishonor and natal alienation are two of the three constituent elements of slavery, not property claims. Dred Scott has no juridical standing because he is not a member of political community. He is not a member of political community because he is a genealogical isolate. And his status as a genealogical isolate is an effect of structural violence. Subsumption by what I've called objective vertigo, which is a sense, subjective vertigo is a sense that I am spinning out of control in my world. Objective vertigo is a sense that my world is spinning out of control all around me. And what I'm arguing at other points in this article is that objective vertigo is how we can, is the imaginative labor of post-colonial and Marxist discourse. But we need subjective vertigo. Yes, but we need objective vertigo and subjective vertigo to think the disorientation of the slave put together. Okay. To hear his case on the basis of proprietary claims, or more to the point, to hear his case at all, is to breach the divide between the living and the dead. In its attempt to make suffering legible, black politics, and this is the problem of black political rhetoric, black political rhetoric often appends itself to the loss of the subaltern. But Taney's ruling throws into relief the failure of this appendage, and it marks this this appendage as compensatory labor that seeks to establish the coherence of prior plenitude, critiques the status of oppression in the moment, and offers an imaginary futurity as when the Black Liberation Army soldiers demanded to be recognized as political prisoners and that their trials be moved to The Hague. But Black people cannot bear witness to the coherence of prior plenitude because their loss is overwhelming and irreparable, without a past, with only a body count in the present, and with desire for redress that must be channeled through conceptual frameworks and cognitive maps which crowd them out as subjects. Thank you.